My name is Marcus Thompson and I'm 47 years old. Until 7 months ago, I was the Director of Operations at Redwood Manufacturing, a mid-sized industrial components company in Charlotte, North Carolina. I had been with that company for 19 years, almost 2 decades of my life dedicated to building something I genuinely believed in. I started when I was 28, fresh out of my MBA program with student loans stacking up and dreams of making a real difference in the manufacturing world. Back in 2005, Redwood was just a modest operation with about 60 employees and annual revenue around $8 million. Nothing spectacular, but it was solid work with good people. The CEO back then was a man named Richard Pemberton, who was in his late 40s and had that old-school work ethic that's becoming increasingly rare these days. Richard hired me as a junior operations manager at a starting salary of $42,000 a year, which wasn't great money, but I was grateful for the opportunity and ready to prove myself. Richard was tough on everyone, demanding and detail-oriented, but he was also incredibly fair and willing to teach anyone who showed genuine interest in learning the business. He took me under his wing and taught me everything about running a manufacturing operation from the ground up: supply chain management, vendor negotiations, quality control systems, lean manufacturing principles, inventory optimization, and how to manage people effectively in a production environment. I worked my absolute ass off during those early years, putting in 60 to 70-hour weeks regularly, coming in on weekends to troubleshoot production issues, staying late to review schedules and make sure we'd hit our targets. It wasn't glamorous work, but I loved the challenge of solving complex operational problems and seeing tangible results from my efforts. Within 3 years, my dedication paid off and I was promoted to operations manager with a significant salary bump. By 2010, I'd proven myself valuable enough to become director of operations, and my salary had grown to $95,000 annually. It still wasn't Silicon Valley tech money, but it was comfortable for Charlotte and I felt respected and valued for my contributions. More importantly than the money, I genuinely loved what I did every single day. I loved the problem-solving aspect of operations, figuring out how to make processes more efficient, how to reduce waste, how to improve quality while controlling costs. I loved building systems that actually worked in the real world, not just on paper. I loved seeing our team hit production targets we'd set together, watching employees grow in their roles, and knowing that the systems I'd built were making a real difference. Under my operational leadership, Redwood grew substantially over the years. By 2015, we'd expanded to 140 employees and hit $23 million in annual revenue. By 2020, we were up to 210 employees doing $47 million in revenue annually. I had personally built the entire operational infrastructure of that company from the ground up. Every system we used, every process we followed, every major efficiency improvement we'd implemented had my fingerprints all over it. Every vendor relationship, every major client account, every key employee in the operations department had been hired, trained, or mentored by me at some point. Richard Pemberton knew exactly how valuable I was to the company's success, and he told me so regularly. "Marcus, you're the backbone of this entire operation," he'd say during our quarterly reviews. "I honestly couldn't do any of this without you. You've built something really special here." My salary had grown to $135,000 by 2023, which was good money for our market and reflected my importance to the organization. I had a nice house in South Charlotte that I'd bought in 2012, my wife Jennifer and I had managed to put both our kids through college completely debt-free, and we'd built a comfortable life for ourselves. We weren't wealthy by any means, but we were stable, happy, and grateful for what we'd built together. I honestly thought I'd retire from Redwood someday, maybe take over as CEO when Richard eventually decided to step down, and finish my career with the company I'd helped build from a small operation into a genuinely successful mid-sized manufacturer. If you're enjoying this story about workplace betrayal and ultimate revenge, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell. We post new justice and karma stories every single week, and trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next in this story. Everything started to change in January of 2023 when Richard called me into his office for what he described as an important and sensitive conversation about the company's future. Richard was 68 years old by that point, and while he was still sharp and engaged, the years were definitely starting to show. He'd been talking vaguely about retirement for the past few years, but he loved the company too much to actually commit to a timeline. His wife had been pressuring him to slow down, and his doctor had recently told him his blood pressure was dangerously high and he needed to reduce his stress levels significantly. "Marcus, sit down," Richard said, gesturing to the leather chair across from his massive oak desk that had been in that office since the company was founded. "I need to talk to you about something important, something I've been thinking about a lot lately." I sat down, feeling a mixture of curiosity and slight anxiety about where this conversation might be heading. "I'm getting old, Marcus," he began with a tired smile. "My doctor keeps warning me that if I don't slow down, I'm going to have a heart attack. Jennifer, my wife, keeps threatening to divorce me if I don't retire soon, and honestly, I think she's only half joking at this point." He paused and looked out the window at the factory floor below. "I've been thinking seriously about succession planning, about what happens to this company when I'm gone, and I want you to know something important. You're at the very top of my list for who should take over as CEO. You've more than earned it after everything you've built here over the past 19 years. I felt a surge of pride and validation hearing those words from the man I'd worked alongside for nearly 2 decades. This was exactly what I'd hoped to hear, confirmation that my years of dedication and hard work had been noticed and would be rewarded with the opportunity to lead the company I'd helped build. But then Richard's expression changed, becoming more complicated and uncertain. "However," he said slowly, and my stomach immediately dropped because nothing good ever follows the word however, in a conversation like this. "There's a complication I need to discuss with you. My son Brendan has been working in finance up in New York for the past 8 years, and he's recently expressed serious interest in coming back to Charlotte and getting involved in the family business." Brendan Pemberton. I'd met Richard's son maybe 3 or 4 times over the years at company holiday parties and family events, and each interaction had left me with the same impression. This was a spoiled, entitled Ivy League graduate who had absolutely no interest in manufacturing and looked down on the entire industry as beneath him. Brendan was 32 years old, had gotten his MBA from Wharton on his father's dime, and had been working at some prestigious investment bank in Manhattan making ridiculous money doing financial analysis and deal structuring. Every single time I'd met him, he'd been arrogant, dismissive of the manufacturing business, and clearly uninterested in anything his father had built. "I want to bring Brendan on board here at Redwood," Richard continued, looking slightly uncomfortable with what he was saying. "Not as CEO immediately, obviously he needs to learn the business first, but I want to give him the opportunity to see if he has what it takes to eventually run this company. It means a lot to me, the idea of keeping this business in the family, having my son take over what I've spent 40 years building." I tried very hard to keep my face neutral and professional, but inside I was already feeling a sense of dread about where this was heading. "What role did you have in mind for him?" I asked carefully, trying to keep any judgment out of my voice. "I want him to work directly under you in operations," Richard explained. "You'll mentor him, teach him how the business actually works from the ground up, show him everything you know about running a manufacturing operation. You're the best person to teach him, Marcus, and if Brendan proves himself, if he really learns the business and earns the respect of the team, then maybe he could be my successor down the road. But if he doesn't work out, if he can't handle it or doesn't fit in here, then the job is absolutely yours. I give you my word on that." What was I supposed to say in that moment? Richard was my boss, this was his company that he'd built from nothing, and Brendan was his only son. I couldn't exactly refuse to mentor the CEO's kid without seriously damaging my relationship with Richard and potentially destroying everything I'd worked for. "Of course I'll help Brendan learn the business," I said, forcing what I hoped was a genuine-looking smile. "If you think he's serious about this, I'd be happy to show him the ropes and teach him how operations works here." Richard looked visibly relieved, like he'd been worried I might refuse or react negatively. "I knew I could count on you, Marcus. This really means everything to me. Teaching my son the business, giving him this opportunity, it's important to me on a level I can't fully explain." Brendan Pemberton started working at Redwood Manufacturing on February 6, 2023, and from his very first day it was immediately obvious that this arrangement was going to be an absolute disaster. His official title was Operations Associate, which was basically a meaningless entry-level position, but everyone in the company knew exactly who he was and why he was there. He showed up that first morning wearing a custom-tailored suit that probably cost $1,500, designer Italian leather shoes, and a Rolex watch that likely cost more than most of our factory workers made in 6 months. He walked through the production floor like he was touring a museum exhibit, looking at the machines and the workers with this detached, almost anthropological curiosity, like we were all part of some quaint little operation he was graciously humoring with his presence. I gave him the same comprehensive orientation I would give any new hire, regardless of whose son they were. I showed him the entire production floor, explained our manufacturing processes in detail, introduced him to all the department heads and key personnel, walked him through our quality control systems, inventory management protocols, and the vendor relationships that kept everything running smoothly. Brendan nodded along politely during my explanations, but I could tell he wasn't really listening or absorbing any of the information I was sharing. He kept checking his phone constantly, texting someone, scrolling through what looked like stock market apps and financial news sites, clearly much more interested in whatever was happening in the finance world than anything going on in the factory around him. During lunch on his very first day, Brendan said something that should have been a massive red flag for everyone involved. "So Marcus," he said casually while picking at an expensive salad he'd brought from some trendy restaurant, "how long do you think it'll take before I can move into a real leadership role here? I'm not really interested in spending years doing entry-level grunt work. I've got an MBA from Wharton, I understand high-level business strategy and financial management. The day-to-day operational stuff, that's what managers and supervisors are for, right?" I just stared at him for a moment, genuinely shocked that he'd say something so dismissive and ignorant about the business his father had spent 4 decades building. "Brendan, operations isn't grunt work," I said, trying to keep my tone educational rather than confrontational. "Operations is literally the core of this entire business. Everything else, sales, finance, admin, all of it exists to support what happens on that factory floor. If you want to eventually run this company, you absolutely need to understand every single aspect of how it works from the ground level up. You need to know how we source materials, how we manage production schedules, how we maintain quality standards, how we handle client relationships, all of it." He waved his hand dismissively, like I was explaining something unnecessarily complicated. Yeah, I get the theory behind it, but I've got an MBA from one of the best business schools in the world. I understand business strategy and operational theory. The tactical execution stuff, that's what we hire people like you to handle. I need to focus on the strategic level, the big picture stuff. This was going to be a very long 6 months, I thought to myself. I reported back to Richard regularly about Brendan's progress, or more accurately, his complete lack of progress and his terrible attitude toward learning the business. "He's really struggling with even the most basic concepts," I told Richard during one of our private meetings in early March. "He doesn't understand our supply chain, he's openly dismissive of the factory workers, he's consistently late to meetings, and he's not taking any of this seriously. Richard, I have to be honest with you, he doesn't seem interested in actually learning how to run a manufacturing operation." Richard sighed heavily, looking older and more tired than I'd ever seen him. "Just give him more time, Marcus. He's adjusting to a completely different work environment than what he's used to in New York. The investment banking world is very different from manufacturing. He'll come around once he gets more comfortable here." By April, things were actually getting worse instead of better. Brendan had started making suggestions about how to improve the business, and every single one of his ideas was absolutely terrible and would have caused serious damage if we'd actually implemented them. He wanted to cut costs by switching to cheaper raw materials from suppliers I'd never heard of, which would have completely destroyed our product quality and our reputation with clients. He wanted to eliminate what he called redundant positions, which were actually critical backup roles that ensured we could handle unexpected absences or production surges. He wanted to outsource our quality control process to a third-party inspection company, which would have been a complete logistical nightmare and would have dramatically increased our defect rates. Every single time I pushed back on his terrible ideas and explained why they wouldn't work in the real world, he'd get defensive and accusatory. "You're just resistant to change, Marcus," he'd say with this condescending tone that made my blood boil. "This is exactly why legacy companies fail and get disrupted. They're run by people like you who are stuck in the past, afraid to innovate, unable to adapt to new business models. You've been doing things the same way for 20 years, and you can't imagine there might be better ways to operate." I bit my tongue so many times during those months that I'm surprised I didn't permanently damage it. But I documented absolutely everything, every meeting, every terrible suggestion he made, every time he showed up late or left early, every interaction where he was dismissive or disrespectful to employees. I kept detailed records in a private file because I had a growing feeling that I was going to need evidence of his incompetence and unprofessional behavior at some point in the future. In May, Richard called me into his office again, and this time he looked genuinely uncomfortable about what he needed to say. "Marcus, I need to talk to you about something that Brendan brought to my attention," he began, avoiding eye contact. "What concerns?" I asked, though I already had a pretty good idea where this was going. "Brendan feels like you're not giving him enough autonomy to make decisions and implement his ideas. He thinks you're micromanaging him because you're threatened by his presence and worried about your own position in the company. He says you're being resistant to his suggestions and preventing him from really contributing meaningfully to the business." I took a deep breath and tried to respond as professionally as possible. "Richard, with all due respect to you and to Brendan, he's been here for exactly 3 months. He barely understands our basic operational processes. The ideas he's been proposing would cause serious damage to the company if we implemented them. I'm not threatened by him, I'm trying to protect the business that you spent 40 years building and that I've spent 19 years helping to grow. That's my job as Director of Operations. Richard held up his hand in a gesture that I'd seen many times over the years when he wanted to end a discussion. I hear what you're saying, Marcus, and I appreciate your perspective. But Brendan is my son, and I need to give him a real chance to prove himself here. I'm asking you as a personal favor to me to step back a little bit. Let him take on more responsibility, let him make some decisions even if you disagree with them. Give him room to learn even if that means he makes some mistakes along the way. Even if those mistakes hurt the company financially? I asked directly, wanting him to understand what he was really asking me to do. Richard looked pained by the question, torn between his role as CEO and his role as a father. I trust you to prevent any catastrophic damage, Marcus. But Brendan needs to feel like he's genuinely contributing and being taken seriously. Please, I'm asking you to do this for me. What choice did I have? He was the CEO, Brendan was his son, and I was an employee who could be replaced if I pushed back too hard. Over the next 2 months, I gave Brendan significantly more rope to make his own decisions and implement his ideas, and he proceeded to hang himself with that rope in spectacular fashion. In June, without consulting me or getting my approval first, Brendan negotiated a new contract with a raw material supplier he'd found online who offered prices that were 15% lower than our current trusted vendor. On paper, to someone who didn't understand manufacturing or quality control, it looked like a smart cost-saving move. In reality, the cheaper materials were absolute garbage with inconsistent quality that didn't meet our specifications. We had to scrap an entire production run worth $85,000 because the components failed quality inspection and couldn't be shipped to our client. I had to fix the mess by going back to our original supplier, apologizing profusely for the disruption, and paying a rush fee to get replacement materials delivered quickly enough to meet our deadline. Brendan didn't take responsibility for the disaster. Instead, he blamed me for not properly vetting his vendor choice and for not having adequate quality control systems in place to catch the material defects earlier in the production process. According to Brendan, the failure was my fault for not supporting his cost-saving initiative properly. In July, he implemented a new production scheduling system he'd read about in some business journal without testing it first or consulting with any of the supervisors who would actually have to use it. The new system looked great in theory, very modern and data-driven, but it was completely incompatible with how our factory actually operated, and it threw our entire production timeline into absolute chaos. We missed delivery deadlines with 3 of our major clients, something that hadn't happened in the 7 years since I'd restructured our scheduling protocols. I spent 72 hours straight working around the clock to fix the disaster, manually rebuilding schedules, calling in favors with suppliers to expedite materials, reassuring angry clients that this was a temporary glitch and wouldn't happen again. We managed to keep all 3 accounts, but just barely, and the relationships were damaged in ways that would take months to fully repair. Once again, Brendan refused to accept responsibility for his poorly planned implementation. According to him, the failure was due to resistance from the operations team who weren't willing to adapt to modern systems and more efficient processes. Richard was getting increasingly frustrated, I could see it in his face during our meetings, but he was also deeply in denial about what was really happening. He desperately wanted his son to succeed and be worthy of taking over the company eventually, so he kept making excuses for Brendan's failures and finding ways to blame external factors rather than acknowledging his son's fundamental incompetence and terrible judgment. Then came August 15, 2023, my 47th birthday. I came into work that morning expecting maybe a card from some of the team members, maybe someone would bring in donuts or cupcakes like we usually did for birthdays around the office. Instead, I was greeted at the door by Paula, Richard's executive assistant who'd been with the company for 12 years. Marcus, Richard and Brendan want to see you in the conference room immediately, she said quietly, and I could see genuine concern and sympathy in her eyes. Something in her tone and expression made my stomach drop with a sense of dread. I walked down the hallway to the main conference room, and when I opened the door I saw Richard sitting at the head of the table looking older and more defeated than I'd ever seen him. Brendan was sitting to his right with his arms crossed and this barely suppressed smug smile on his face, like he was enjoying some private joke. There was a woman I didn't recognize sitting across from them with a briefcase and a stack of official-looking documents spread out in front of her. HR, I realized immediately. This was a termination meeting. Marcus, please sit down, Richard said quietly, still unable to make eye contact with me directly. I sat down slowly, my mind racing through possibilities and trying to understand what was happening. Marcus, this is very difficult for me to say, Richard began, his voice strained with emotion. You've been an incredibly valuable member of this company for many years, and I personally owe you a debt of gratitude for everything you've built here. But Brendan and I have been discussing the future direction of the operations department extensively, and we've made the decision that it's time for a significant change in leadership. A change in leadership? I repeated, wanting him to say it explicitly. Brendan leaned forward, not even trying to hide his satisfaction anymore. What my father is trying to say, Marcus, is that your services are no longer needed here. We're letting you go effective immediately. Your position is being eliminated as part of a restructuring of the operations department. The room felt like it was spinning. After 19 years of dedication, after building the entire operational infrastructure of this company from scratch, after countless 60 and 70-hour weeks, after sacrificing time with my family to solve problems and meet deadlines, they were firing me. On my birthday. You're firing me? I said, looking directly at Richard and ignoring Brendan entirely. After 19 years of loyalty and results, you're actually firing me? Richard finally forced himself to meet my eyes, and I could see genuine pain and conflict in his expression. It's not personal, Marcus, you have to understand that. It's just that Brendan has brought a lot of fresh perspectives and new ideas to the company. He has an MBA from Wharton, he understands modern business practices and innovative strategies. And frankly, there's been ongoing friction and conflict between you two that's become disruptive to the organization. We think it's best for everyone if Brendan takes over the operations department directly and builds his own team without that tension. On my birthday? I said quietly, unable to keep the hurt out of my voice. You chose to fire me on my actual birthday? Brendan shrugged with complete indifference, like the timing was just an unfortunate coincidence of no real importance. That's just when we scheduled the meeting, Marcus. Don't make this more emotional and dramatic than it needs to be. This is just business. The HR woman, whose name I later learned was Patricia Morris, pushed a severance package across the table toward me. Mr. Thompson, we're offering you 8 weeks of severance pay, which we believe is very generous, continuation of your health insurance benefits for 3 months, and we'll provide a neutral reference letter for future employment opportunities. If you sign this separation agreement, which includes a standard non-compete clause and a non-disparagement agreement, you'll receive the full severance package. If you choose not to sign, we'll process your termination without any severance compensation. 8 weeks of severance after 19 years of building and running their entire operation. It was insulting, degrading, a complete dismissal of nearly 2 decades of my professional life. I looked at Richard one more time, giving him a final chance to reconsider this terrible decision. Is this really what you want, Richard? I asked him directly. After everything we've built together, after 19 years of partnership, is this really how you want this to end? Richard looked away, unable to maintain eye contact. I think this is what's best for the company's future, he said weakly, and I could tell these weren't even really his words but rather something Brendan had convinced him to believe. I need time to review this separation agreement with an attorney, I said, standing up from the table. You have until 5 o'clock this afternoon to sign, Patricia said in her practiced HR voice. If you don't sign by end of business today, we'll process your termination without severance and you'll need to clear out your office immediately. I walked out of that conference room in a complete daze, feeling like the floor had disappeared beneath my feet. Paula caught me in the hallway just outside the conference room, and I could see tears in her eyes. Marcus, I'm so incredibly sorry, she whispered, looking around to make sure no one else was nearby. This is completely wrong, everyone knows this is wrong. You built this company's operations from nothing. Did you know this was coming? I asked her. She nodded sadly. Brendan's been planning this for weeks, maybe longer. He's been systematically undermining you to Richard, convincing him that you're the problem, that you're holding the company back from modernizing and growing. Richard's not thinking clearly anymore, Marcus. He's so desperate for Brendan to succeed and take over the company that he's willing to believe anything his son tells him, even when it contradicts everything he's seen with his own eyes for the past 19 years. I went back to my office, closed the door, and immediately called my wife Jennifer to tell her what had just happened. They fired me, I said, my voice shaking with a mixture of shock and anger. After 19 years they fired me. On my birthday. She was silent for a long moment, processing the news. Then she said something that would turn out to be absolutely prophetic. Marcus, we're going to fight this. Not in court necessarily, but we're going to make sure they understand exactly what they just did. You built that company's operations, you have relationships with every major client and vendor, and they're going to realize very quickly that they made a catastrophic mistake. That afternoon, I called an employment attorney named David Chin who'd helped a friend of mine navigate a wrongful termination case a few years earlier. I brought him the severance agreement and explained the entire situation, the 19 years of exemplary service, the CEO's incompetent son being brought in to learn the business, the systematic undermining of my position, and finally the birthday termination with an insulting severance package. David reviewed the separation agreement carefully, paying particular attention to the non-compete and non-disparagement clauses. "Don't sign this agreement, Marcus," he said immediately and firmly. "This non-compete clause is absurdly broad and restrictive. They're trying to prevent you from working anywhere in the manufacturing industry in North Carolina for 2 full years, which is completely unreasonable after 19 years of employment. They're essentially trying to destroy your ability to earn a living in your chosen field. Can I fight the actual termination?" I asked hopefully. "Do I have any kind of wrongful termination case here?" David shook his head regrettably. "North Carolina is an at-will employment state, which means employers can terminate employees for almost any reason or even no reason at all, as long as it's not based on illegal discrimination or retaliation for protected activities. Unless you can prove they fired you because of your age, race, religion, or some other protected characteristic, or because you reported illegal activity, you don't really have grounds for a wrongful termination lawsuit. It's unfair and it's terrible business judgment, but it's not illegal. So I'm just screwed then," I said, feeling defeated. "Not necessarily," David replied thoughtfully. "Here's what I recommend. Don't sign their agreement with the restrictive non-compete. Let them terminate you without the severance package. File for unemployment benefits immediately. And most importantly, start documenting everything you know about the company's operations, client relationships, vendor contracts, ongoing projects, potential problems. Not to use maliciously or to actively sabotage them, but to protect yourself and your professional reputation, and to be prepared if opportunities arise where your knowledge and expertise might be valuable to other companies." I took his advice and didn't sign the separation agreement. That evening, Richard's assistant Patricia called me to ask if I'd made a decision about the severance package. "I'm not signing your non-compete clause," I told her. "It's unreasonably restrictive and my attorney has advised me not to sign it. If you want to terminate me, go ahead and do it, but I'm not agreeing to restrictions that would prevent me from working in my industry for 2 years. They terminated me that same evening without any severance compensation. I went back to the office after hours when most people had gone home, packed up my personal belongings from 19 years in that office, and walked out of Redwood Manufacturing for what I thought would be the last time. Brendan was still there, working late or more likely just waiting to watch me leave, and he stood in his doorway with that same smug expression as I walked past carrying my box of personal items. "Good luck finding another job at your age, Marcus," he said with fake sympathy. "The manufacturing industry is changing rapidly, and I'm sure you'll eventually land on your feet somewhere. Maybe try looking at smaller companies who need someone with your old-school approach." I didn't respond, didn't give him the satisfaction of seeing how angry and hurt I was. I just kept walking, got in my car, and drove home to figure out what the hell I was going to do next with my career and my life. For the first week after being fired, I'll admit I was in a state of shock and depression. 19 years of my professional life, gone in a single day. No retirement party, no appreciation for my contributions, no acknowledgement of everything I'd built, just an insulting severance offer and a humiliating escort out of the building. But then, in the second week, something interesting started happening that would change everything. My phone started ringing with calls from people I'd worked with over the years, and what they had to say was very enlightening about the situation at Redwood. The first call came from Tom Richardson, the CEO of Richardson Industrial, which was Redwood's single largest client with annual contracts worth approximately $7 million. I'd personally managed that relationship for the past 12 years, and Tom and I had developed a strong professional friendship built on trust, reliability, and consistent results. "Marcus, what the hell happened over there?" Tom asked when I answered my phone. "I heard through the grapevine that you're out at Redwood that they actually let you go. Please tell me that's just a rumor." "It's true," I confirmed. "Richard's son Brendan is taking over operations, and they decided they didn't need me anymore." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "The kid who's been there for 6 months? The one who screwed up our July order so badly that you had to personally fix it and work 72 hours straight? That Brendan is now running operations." "That's correct," I said. "Marcus, I need you to understand something important," Tom said seriously. "I've only stayed with Redwood all these years because of you personally. You've saved our asses more times than I can even count, fixing problems before they became disasters, going above and beyond to meet impossible deadlines, always being available when we needed you. I trust you, Marcus. I don't know this Brendan kid at all, and based on what I've seen so far, I'm not impressed. When our contract comes up for renewal in November, I'm going to need to seriously reconsider whether we want to continue working with Redwood if you're not there anymore. 3 more major clients called me that same week with essentially identical messages. Sarah Chin from Apex Manufacturing, whose account was worth approximately $4 million annually. Miguel Rodriguez from Coastal Fabrication at $3.2 million per year. Dennis Patterson from Tri-State Components at $2.8 million annually. All of them expressed serious concerns about continuing their relationships with Redwood now that I was gone. All of them made it clear that their loyalty had been to me personally rather than to the company, and all of them hinted that if I ended up somewhere else, they'd be very interested in potentially following me to a new manufacturer. I started to realize something profound. I had significantly more leverage in this situation than I'd initially understood. Over 19 years, I hadn't just built operational systems and processes, I'd built relationships, trust, and a professional reputation that was apparently worth far more than I'd given myself credit for. In mid-September, about a month after my termination, I got a call that would change everything. The caller was James Morrison, CEO of Titanium Solutions, a manufacturing company based in Raleigh that specialized in similar industrial components as Redwood but was slightly smaller, doing about $35 million in annual revenue compared to Redwood's $47 million. Marcus, I've been trying to recruit you away from Redwood for years, James said cheerfully. I heard you're finally available, and I'd love to talk to you about an opportunity here if you're interested. We met for coffee the next day at a Starbucks halfway between Charlotte and Raleigh. James laid out an offer that was substantially better than what I'd been making at Redwood. Chief Operating Officer with a base salary of $175,000, which was $40,000 more than my previous salary, plus a performance bonus structure that could add another $50,000 annually based on hitting revenue and efficiency targets, plus equity in the company at 5% ownership, which would give me a real stake in the business's success and potentially significant value if the company continued growing or was eventually sold. Marcus, I know exactly what you built at Redwood over 19 years, James said. I've watched your career, I've heard from clients about how you operate, and I've always been impressed by your reputation in the industry. I want you to come here and build the same kind of operational excellence at Titanium Solutions. And I promise you something right now, I don't have any sons or nephews or incompetent relatives who are going to come in and push you out after you've done all the hard work. This would be your operation to run as you see fit. I accepted his offer on the spot, but then James made an additional proposal that was even more interesting. Marcus, I'm going to be completely honest with you about something, he said, leaning forward. If you could potentially bring over some of your client relationships from Redwood, clients who might be interested in working with you personally regardless of which company you're with, we would be extremely grateful and willing to compensate you significantly for that. I'm not asking you to steal clients or violate any agreements, but if they choose to follow you of their own accord because they value your expertise and reliability, that's just good business and fair competition. He slid a revised employment contract across the table. If you can bring over $10 million or more in annual contracts within your first 6 months here, we'll increase your equity stake from 5% to 10% of the company, and we'll add a $100,000 signing bonus on top of your base salary. Does that sound like something that might be achievable? I thought about the calls I'd already received from Tom Richardson, Sarah Chin, Miguel Rodriguez, and Dennis Patterson, all of them expressing concerns about continuing with Redwood and hinting that they'd be interested in following me elsewhere. I thought about the non-compete agreement that Redwood had tried to force me to sign, the one I'd refused because my attorney had advised me it was unreasonably broad and likely unenforceable anyway. I thought about Brendan's smug face on my birthday when he'd fired me, his dismissive comment about me finding work at my age, his complete lack of respect for everything I'd built over 19 years. I thought about Richard's weakness, his inability to stand up for what was right, his willingness to throw away a 19-year partnership because his spoiled son had manipulated him. Let me make some phone calls, I told James with a smile. I think that might be very achievable. Over the next 3 weeks, I systematically reached out to every major client I'd worked with during my time at Redwood. I didn't badmouth the company, didn't trash Brendan or Richard, didn't try to actively sabotage them or steal their business. I simply let each client know professionally that I'd moved to a new role as Chief Operating Officer at Titanium Solutions, and that if they ever wanted to work with me again personally, I'd be happy to discuss how we might be able to help them with their manufacturing needs. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Tom Richardson from Richardson Industrial was the very first client to make the switch. "Marcus, I'm going to be completely blunt with you," he said during our call. "I gave Brendan 2 full months to prove that he could handle our account competently, and he's been an absolute disaster. Our last shipment from Redwood had a 12% defect rate, which is completely unacceptable. You never once let our defect rate get above 1% during all the years you managed our account. I'm done giving them chances. Send me a formal proposal from Titanium Solutions for taking over our manufacturing contracts." $7 million in annual revenue moved from Redwood to Titanium Solutions just like that. Sarah Chin from Apex Manufacturing was next, bringing $4 million in annual contracts with her. Then Miguel Rodriguez with $3.2 million. Then Dennis Patterson with $2.8 million. Within 8 weeks of starting my new position at Titanium Solutions, I'd successfully brought over $17 million in annual contracts, all from clients who'd made their own independent decisions to follow me based on years of proven reliability and trust. James Morrison was absolutely thrilled with the results. He immediately increased my equity stake from 5% to 12% as promised, paid out the $100,000 signing bonus, and gave me complete operational control of the company with minimal oversight or interference. Meanwhile, back at Redwood Manufacturing, things were falling apart spectacularly and far faster than even I had anticipated. Without those major client contracts that had suddenly disappeared, their annual revenue dropped from $47 million down to approximately $23 million almost overnight, a catastrophic 50% reduction that put the entire company's future in serious jeopardy. Brendan, predictably, refused to accept any responsibility for the disaster he'd created. According to multiple people who still worked there and kept me updated, he blamed everyone except himself for the company's failures. He fired 3 experienced department heads within 2 months, claiming they were resistant to his leadership and sabotaging his initiatives. More employees quit voluntarily, unwilling to work under his incompetent and arrogant management. More clients left, either following me to Titanium Solutions or simply finding other manufacturers who could provide the reliability and quality that Redwood was no longer delivering. By January of 2024, just 5 months after I'd been fired, Redwood was in genuinely serious financial trouble. They'd been forced to lay off 60 employees in November, good people who'd done nothing wrong except have the misfortune of working for a company run into the ground by an incompetent CEO's son. Paula, Richard's longtime assistant, kept me quietly informed about what was happening internally, and the picture she painted was grim. "Richard knows he made a terrible mistake, Marcus," she told me during one of our coffee meetings. "He knows it in his heart, but his pride won't let him admit it out loud, especially not to Brendan. And Brendan keeps telling him that all the company's problems are because of legacy issues that you supposedly left behind, that the business model was already broken before he took over, that he's actually fixing long-term structural problems even though it's painful in the short term." In February, 5 months after firing me on my birthday, I received a phone call I'd been half expecting. It was Richard Pemberton himself, and his voice sounded tired and defeated in a way I'd never heard before. "Marcus, I need to talk to you," he said quietly. "I'm listening," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. "I made a mistake, Marcus. A terrible, catastrophic mistake. I should never have let Brendan push you out of the company. You were right about everything and I was blind to it because I wanted so desperately for my son to succeed. The company is falling apart without you. We've lost 40% of our revenue, we've had to lay off dozens of good employees, and I'm genuinely looking at the possibility of bankruptcy if things don't turn around soon." He paused and I could hear him struggling emotionally. "I want you to come back, Marcus. I'm begging you. Name your price, whatever you want. I'll make Brendan step aside completely, you can have full control of operations again, we'll give you equity in the company, whatever it takes. Please, I need you to save this company." I let the silence hang there for a long moment, letting him sit with the discomfort of what he was asking. "Richard, I appreciate you calling and I appreciate the apology," I said finally. "But I'm very happy at Titanium Solutions. I have 12% equity here, I have complete operational autonomy, I have a CEO who trusts my judgment and doesn't second-guess my decisions, and I'm building something really special. I don't have any interest in going back to Redwood." "I'll give you 20% equity," Richard said desperately. "And I'll make you president of the company, not just director of operations. Brendan will report to you if he even stays, which honestly at this point I don't think he will. Marcus, please, I'm begging you. I know I don't deserve your help after what happened, but I'm asking anyway. Richard, even if I wanted to come back, which I genuinely don't, it's too late to save what you've lost," I explained. The clients I spent years building relationships with have moved on to other manufacturers. Your reputation in the industry has been seriously damaged. The talented employees who made Redwood successful have either been fired by Brendan or have quit to work elsewhere. It would take years to rebuild what's been destroyed, and frankly, I don't think the company has years. You're probably looking at selling to a private equity firm or shutting down completely. So you're just going to let the company die? Richard asked, and now there was anger creeping into his voice along with the desperation. I didn't let anything die, Richard, I said firmly. You made a choice. You chose your incompetent son over 19 years of loyalty, proven results, and a genuine partnership. You fired me on my birthday with an insulting severance package after nearly 2 decades of building your operations from nothing. You stood there and let him humiliate me. Those were your decisions, your choices. Now you're living with the consequences of those decisions, and I'm sorry, but that's not my responsibility to fix. Marcus, please, I'm begging you one more time. I wish you well, Richard, I genuinely do, I interrupted. But I've moved on and you need to accept that. Goodbye. I hung up the phone, and I'll admit, it felt incredibly satisfying. Redwood Manufacturing filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection in April of 2024, less than 8 months after I'd been fired. The company was eventually sold to a private equity firm for a small fraction of its former value, with most of the proceeds going to creditors and secured lenders. Richard was forced into retirement by the bankruptcy proceedings and lost most of his ownership stake. The last I heard, Brendan had moved back to New York with his tail thoroughly between his legs, returning to the finance world where he could pretend his brief disastrous stint running a manufacturing company had never happened. As for me personally and professionally, Titanium Solutions has been thriving beyond anyone's expectations. In my first full year as Chief Operating Officer, we grew annual revenue from $35 million to $52 million, a nearly 50% increase driven by both the clients I'd brought with me and new business we'd won through improved operations and reputation. We've hired 120 new employees to handle the growth, including 15 excellent people who'd worked for me at Redwood and jumped ship after I left. I'm currently on track to become CEO of Titanium Solutions when James Morrison retires in approximately 3 years, which he's already told me is his plan. My 12% equity stake in the company is currently worth approximately $4.2 million based on our most recent valuation, and that number keeps growing as the company continues expanding. I'm making significantly more money than I ever did at Redwood. I have more respect and autonomy than I've ever had in my career. I work with people who genuinely appreciate my contributions, and I'm building something I can be truly proud of for the long term. Jennifer and I recently bought a beautiful house in a nice neighborhood in Raleigh, and we're finally able to enjoy the financial security and quality of life that 19 years of hard work should have earned us. I learned some incredibly valuable lessons from this entire experience. Loyalty absolutely has to be a two-way street in any professional relationship. I gave Redwood Manufacturing 19 years of my life, my expertise, my nights and weekends, my complete dedication to building their operational systems and growing their business. I brought them from $8 million in revenue to $47 million. I built their entire operational infrastructure from scratch. I saved countless client relationships and prevented innumerable disasters. And the moment it became inconvenient for them, the moment the boss's spoiled and incompetent son wanted my position, they discarded me like I was completely disposable. On my birthday, no less. So I did exactly what any intelligent professional would do in that situation. I took my skills, my expertise, my relationships, my reputation, and my institutional knowledge, and I built something significantly better somewhere else with people who actually valued what I brought to the table. That's not revenge in the traditional sense. That's just smart career management and recognizing your own worth in the marketplace. Richard and Brendan destroyed their own company through a combination of arrogance, nepotism, poor judgment, and short-sighted decision-making. I didn't have to sabotage them or actively work against them. I simply had to step aside, take my expertise elsewhere, and let them fail spectacularly on their own merits. Sometimes the best form of revenge isn't revenge at all. Sometimes it's simply being excellent at what you do, recognizing your own value, and letting incompetent people expose themselves through their own actions and decisions. Sometimes it's about having the confidence to walk away from people who don't appreciate you and finding people who do. And sometimes, just sometimes, it's about watching from a safe distance as the people who wronged you face the natural consequences of their own terrible choices while you build something better somewhere else. If you enjoyed this story, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever been fired unfairly or pushed out of a job you dedicated years to? How did you handle it? What would you have done differently in my situation? And please, if you found this story valuable or entertaining, subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell so you don't miss future stories about workplace justice, karma, and people getting exactly what they deserve. Thanks for listening to my story, and I'll see you in the next one.